All right, so now let's look at a few of the details of cellular respiration. Okay? Now, first of all, you probably already know cellular respiration takes place in the mitochondrion. And we always call the mitochondrion the powerhouse of the cell, the mighty mitochondrion. And why we call it that is because, again, it's involved in energy transformation. It's really good at transforming energy from glucose into energy of ATP, which all cells need. Okay? So it happens in what we usually identify as a three-step process, okay? And so we'll go through each of those three steps. But before we get into those steps, I first want you to notice about the actual mitochondria itself. First of all, you got these little, it's a membranous structure. It's made out of membrane just like the chloroplast and just like all the other membranous structures within the cell, the Golgi and the ER and all that stuff, okay? So what it has is these extensions are called cristae, and they are extensions of surface area. What's embedded in these membranes here are enzymes, okay, just like in the thylakoid membranes of the chloroplast. We have enzymes that are embedded all in this extra surface area, this extra space, this extra membrane space. Enzymes that are going to do the specific job of converting sugars into ATP. Okay, so they're all in there, and that's why this particular organelle is highly specialized to do its job. That's why we call it the mighty mitochondrion, the powerhouse of the cell. Okay, all right, Stone, out of the way. Okay, so first of all, come back around over here. So we're going to do it this way. Okay, so step one is the step of cellular respiration. First of all, we want to emphasize that in this first step, it doesn't actually happen inside the mitochondria. It actually takes place just outside the mitochondria in the, the cellular matrix, the cytoplasm, or what do you want to call it? Okay, and this step is called glycolysis. Whoops, I left out an L there. Glycolysis, glucose. Lysis means to break apart. So what happens in this very first step is, and we usually show glucose as a 6-carbon molecule. I don't know if I'm going to have enough chalk to do all this, but we take the 6 carbons of glucose and they get broken into 2 3-carbon molecules. Okay? Those 2 3-carbon molecules are called pyruvates or pyruvic acid. So this is glucose here, and it gets broken up into, I'm going to just abbreviate it, you're going to have to look it up, pyruvic acid or pyruvates. Okay, now we got 2 of those. Now this process is breaking up of the glucose into pyruvates actually yields a couple of ATP molecules. So I'm going to put 2 ATP down here. Okay, and I always put my little starburst to show that we're getting energy here. Okay, and as it turns out, glycolysis is also a regenerative cycle, so it can kind of maintain itself. Okay, I don't have room to draw all the details here, but glycolysis can regenerate itself. It doesn't involve the mitochondria. It takes place outside the mitochondria, and it can generate a little bit of ATP. And there are a lot of organisms, a lot of single-celled organisms that don't have mitochondria. This is their only mechanism for generating ATP, and it works for them because they're simple. So this is actually a very ancient process, been around since the very, very first living things figured out how to generate ATP. Now, where cellular respiration, where the next step comes in, this is where it starts to get interesting. Okay, we talk about cellular respiration as being an aerobic process, okay? Aerobic. What does that mean? It means it involves oxygen, okay? Oxygen, right? When you're doing aerobic exercise, you're using oxygen to maximize muscle movement, okay? So if the mitochondria has oxygen available, in other words, it's already diffused into the mitochondria, then what will happen is these 2 pyruvic acids will also diffuse into the mitochondria, okay? And when they do, they will enter step 2 of cellular respiration, that we refer to as, and it's a cycle, so I'm going to draw my arrows here, referred to as the Krebs. Another room there. Krebs cycle, named after a German scientist who discovered it, Hans Krebs. Okay, or Krebs. At any rate, the Krebs cycle does a number of things. Oh, I forgot to mention something about glycolysis. It's very important. Okay, one of the things that makes it a regenerative cycle is because that, and there's some very complex biochemistry going on here that you don't have to know a whole lot about. Okay, but the long and the short of it is that in this breaking up of the glucose molecule and the regenerating of the cycle, some electrons get stripped off hydrogen atoms and they get carried away from the process, and they're going to get used later on in the last step of the process, which will come later. Okay, but it involves a particular type of electron carrying molecule called it's FADH2. Okay, FADH2. NADH was in photosynthesis. This one's FADH2. It takes electrons from this glycolysis process and it carries them and it takes them over to the mitochondria where they're going to be used later. That's a very relevant step. Okay, shouldn't have left it out, but we'll use it here in a minute. Now back to the Krebs cycle. Oxygen's available, pyruvic acid diffuse in. They get in the Krebs cycle, they are going to get used. Okay, those pyruvic acid, these carbons in this pyruvic acid will generate CO2. Okay, they'll break up those carbons and some of them will get passed along and used in other ways, but some of them will get used as CO2. Okay, so that's one thing that happens in the Krebs cycle. But another thing that happens in the Krebs cycle is that some more ATP gets made. Okay, how many? Just a couple more, just 2. Okay, so 2 ATP here, but you know, again, it's some energy. It's starting to add up. We're starting to see some of the efficiency of this process coming to fruition. Okay, now what also happens again here is that we get some more of that FADH2. Okay, but also some NADH2. No, I'm sorry. Yes, that's right. Okay. Those will also collect electrons that are going to be used in this final step. Okay. So the electrons, that's not right. I'm going to have to go back.
It's just NADH.
NADH, that's right. The 2's not on there. That's right. But the main thing is like in photosynthesis, these very complex molecules have the capability of moving electrons, bonding with electrons, and transporting them to places where their energy can be extracted. And that is the third and final step of cellular respiration. Okay, and we refer to it as the electron, which I'm going to abbreviate with E, transport chain. Okay, and it gets a lot of attention at this step because all these electrons that were being carried here and here and here, okay, they're going to get dropped off. And again, this is a very complex set of reactions, a lot of complex enzymes, multi-steps, way more complicated than we need to learn about at this level. But the important thing is that these electrons associated with energy at this step get used to put together a whole bunch of ATP. How many is a whole bunch, Mr. DuPont? Well, if all things go as they should, something like 32 ATP. Okay? 32 ATP at this step alone. Okay? Right? So, the electron transport, now how does it happen? Well, we haven't checked off our final ingredient here. Okay? We've got the glucose that came in over here. We forgot to add it, but here's where it is. Here's where the oxygen comes in. Okay? The oxygen, and for you AP students, this is one of those details you guys need to know. Remember, the oxygen is the final electron acceptor. And so oxygen at this stage has the ability to accept electrons, to grab those hydrogens that are part of these molecules that are carrying it, okay? and then form the final product of cellular respiration, which is, go back and look at your formula, the water. Okay? So in goes glucose actually as pyruvic acid. Out comes CO2. Over here, oxygen gets used in the electron transport chain, and out comes H2O. But remember that all the while we've also been generating a couple of ATP here, a couple more here, and 32 here. Okay? So let's just review real quick the steps of cellular respiration. And they're important. Step 1, glycolysis, breaking the sugar, and that gives us 2 ATP. Okay. Step 2, the Krebs cycle also gives us 2 ATP. And then finally, the electron transport chain. I forgot what?
Starbursts.
Oh yeah, I'll put them on there. Electron transport chain. That's going to give us, again, and this is if all goes optimally in each and every mitochondria of the cell. Okay, 32 ATP. And again, this exact number is going to vary depending on which source you're getting your information from, but somewhere around 34 to 36 ATP is generally the number we say. So 36 ATP out of one little old glucose molecule, and now we have energy to do some work. Okay, and so for every mitochondria, for every glucose molecule that you intake in the form of food, we get a whole bunch of ATP, energy to fuel our daily lives, like staying safe and healthy. Okay, I wanted to take just a minute to go back over a couple of things here because I made some mislabels, some molecules yesterday when I was going over this. So in glycolysis, the first step of cellular respiration, the electron carrying molecule is going to be NADH, okay, not FADH2, okay? And it's going to carry all of the electrons that it gets from glycolysis over here to the electron transport chain, okay? Now in the Krebs cycle, which is step 2, okay, we're going to get some more NADH and some FADH2, okay? But the important thing to remember about both of these molecules is that they are considered electron carriers, okay? So they carry high energy electrons to the electron transport chain where they are going to be used to generate all this tremendous amount of ATP, okay? Now for you pre-AP students, that's about as far as we need to go with this, okay? But for you AP students, remember that there's some chemiosmosis going on in here. There's some enzymes. The ATP synthase enzyme is putting together all this. So go back and review the steps of what's going on in the electron transport chain, chemiosmosis and all that kind of stuff that helps form all that ATP, okay?